Hey, John, it's Dan Ellsberg. Nice to hear from you. And I have, as you learned, I guess, about a month or maybe two left, although as of this moment, it seems like it might be a lot shorter than that. But I just want to say now how warmly I remember you. And by the way, I've been quoting you to a number of people lately on Vietnam. Don't ask me to whom, because I couldn't tell you even if it was this morning. My short-term memory had gone to pot, gone nowhere. But I was in particular quoting the quote from Westmoreland to you, if I recall correctly, said that he had really wanted 750,000 men in Vietnam. That's the number we had in mind. Anyway, how much better your study was than anyone else's. Good luck to you and to your Institute for Freedom. And keep at it. It will never be not needed. Bye.
Thank you for your service. I say this not to the employees of the war machine, who in truth serve nothing besides imperial domination and the profit margins of Raytheon and Lockheed Martin. I say this to the peacemakers, to the truth-tellers, to the defiant ones, to those who've shone the light of truth upon the blood-spattered face of the empire against their own interests for the benefit of everyone. To those who've stared down the barrel of the most powerful military force ever assembled and said, "Do your worst." To the grandparents who've been dragged from nuclear weapons protests in handcuffs to create a safer world for their grandchildren. To the activists whose incurable disobedience has led them to disrupt empire managers at think tank conferences or paint "No War" across the face of the Sydney Opera House. To the selfless martyrs who've exposed the abuses of the machine, knowing full well that the scales of justice are weighted heavily against them. To the hero in Belmarsh, to the Pentagon Papers whistleblower who today closed his gentle, loving eyes for a final time. Thank you for your service, for serving the highest interest over your own, for pouring everything you've got into the hope for a better tomorrow, for betting everything on the hope of a healthy and harmonious world, for creating a guiding light to help humanity steer its way home, for seizing your moment to help make things right instead of letting it pass like everyone around you, for somehow finding the strength to swim against the current when it would be so much easier to drift along with the madness, for somehow finding a higher calling in this wildly dysfunctional society where everything is pointed at selfishness and meaninglessness, for somehow cultivating something profound and authentic within yourself in the midst of a civilization of the vapid and fraudulent, for doing your very best to get a foot on the brake pedal when everything else is accelerating toward the cliff's edge, for listening to that small voice within which can tolerate no more, for turning around, for taking your stand, for finding the courage, for doing what is right, for putting truth first, for lighting the way. Thank you for your service. We will do our best to carry the torch forward and finish what you began.
What a beautiful piece, Caitlin. So moving. I'm delighted to be here. I offered to come because of a remark Dan made about 2 months ago when he was still in the 4-month period of the decline towards dying, but he was still well in his energy and feeling fine. And the thing we were talking about tribe and what tribes we feel we belong to. And he said, my tribe is people who put their bodies on the line. And he meant, of course, civil disobedience and whistleblowers. And whistleblowers, certainly you put your body on the line. I know, having been married to one for 53 years in August, and it's not an easy life. Dan used to be happy at Rand when he believed that the Cold War, the best way was to build up our nuclear weapons to save us from attack. And he loved the community of really bright men all working together on an urgent cause. And throughout our marriage, after he left and couldn't go back for sure and didn't want to, he would often dream about it because it was such a community. And so often whistleblowers, and Dan in his life was alone. There was also a community that embraced him, but the life of a public intellectual was one where he was often alone and then also with colleagues whom he loved. But that's a difficult journey to take on one's own. And Dan was so moved. Every time he would read about a whistleblower in the news, he would be elated. He also was kind of puzzled that there weren't more, because there's so much that has to be the whistle blown on. And so he was thinking, why aren't there more? And he was so grateful for each and everyone, knowing what that means. That it's not only loss of your community, but difficult to get another job and to get criticized and exiled. It's a real punishment for doing what you think is right. And yet, I don't know anyone who's taken that kind of step that regrets it for the very reason that they know that it was the right thing to do. I think the need for whistleblowers is just as big today as it was when we released the Pentagon Papers during the Vietnam War. When Dan was talking about his legacy, because he was interviewed once it was known that he was leaving us, and he would be asked, what is your legacy? And he'd say, I hate that word because I don't know that there's much legacy. I came in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I'm leaving in the Ukraine threats of first use of nuclear weapons. And I'm not sure there's a big legacy in terms of nuclear weapons improvement of the chances that they won't be used. And so in some ways, when he learned the diagnosis, he was surprisingly relieved. I was there when the first time we heard that, and we only heard that after that from other doctors, that he had about 3 to 6 months to live. And in some ways, he was almost ebullient, to use our son's word. He hadn't seen his father in as sustained good spirits for maybe ever. Of course, he was capable of that, but then he would get knowing about what was going on in the world, and he wouldn't be so ebullient anymore. And he said, it's not up to me. It's not on my shoulders anymore. Not that he thought he alone could change the world, but he felt this overwhelming obligation to do whatever he could. And the last 4 months of his life were much more relaxed, even though very busy. First of all, he got to eat anything he wanted, and he'd been on a salt-free diet. So I had to go for runs to the bagel shop for lox and bagels and schmears practically every day for the best fresh bagels in town. and cakes, and he got so much pleasure from it. He also got enormous pleasure from the messages he got, which happened because of two unexpected things. One is he wrote a letter to some of his colleagues explaining that he was terminally diagnosed with cancer, and he said, "I have a certain number of months to live," and as a result, he got a tremendous amount of messages, because the tweet that he did was retweeted over 2 million times, and then sent out on Facebook and other sources, places where it could be read. So he must have gotten 1,000 messages from the time he sent out that tweet. And also there was an article in the New York Times that said that he was approaching death. So between those two publications, he got an enormous flood of messages. And they were so many from his friends, but many from people he'd never met, or perhaps met when he gave a lecture, because he did a lot of lectures. And they said, someone would say, I drove you to the airport, and that talk changed my life, and I became an activist ever since meeting you. So it was an enormously rewarding time. And then also he did get many requests for interviews, and that gave him pleasure to kind of say his last message, like, this is a dangerous time and we have to take action to change it. So that we were blessed in many ways. We were mainly in a cocoon of family. His two oldest children were able to be here quite a lot, and our son lives downstairs, so he was here a lot. And two of his best friends were here a lot. And the hospice nurse. And that was about it for company, except that he was on Zoom enormous amount and on the phone a lot, giving interviews. But it was, I think, a time where he felt so relieved of pressure, and a feeling that he'd lived his life well. And so that there was a sense of satisfaction. I've done all that I could, or at least I tried the hardest I knew how to do all that I could. And so there was this kind of joy in him. And so in some ways, the loss of him is less full of grief, because he was in such good spirits. And so I carry that in my heart. And every time I think of him, which is many times during the day, I feel like I'm getting this energetic hug from him, probably more than I got when he was alive, just this sense of warmth and love. And we were married for 53 years come August. And of course, there were ups and downs and challenges external and within the relationship as well. But we never stopped loving each other. And I would say that in all the years that I was by his side, and that was one of the main things I loved, that's where I wanted to be, I never saw him do anything that was self-serving at the cost of the common good, ever, or even think about it. So he was a man of utmost integrity. And of course, that made me love him, in addition to the fact that he was charming and handsome and intelligent and all those other things. So I just want to end by saying how much he admired the whistleblowers, the people who put their bodies on the line in civil disobedience, facing jail, facing loss of financial support, problems with the family, putting the family through so much. He just really knew about it and appreciated it, and so do I. And so I want to thank the Whistleblower Summit and everyone here, and all the whistleblowers that could be here, even if they aren't, and for your enormous service to the world. And if you have the wherewithal and the desire, keep it up, because we need you. And it's wonderful to be celebrating you and celebrating Dan. I have the feeling of him looking down and beaming at this tribute. And I know that's wishful thinking, but that's what I feel. And I just want to send his love and my love to all of you. Thank you so much. That's what whistleblowers are, and that's what this conference is about, and it's wonderful.
I first met Daniel Ellsberg while we were both attached to Harvard in I think it was early 1958, and we were brought together by a common friend, a journalist who was studying there at Harvard for the year, and thought we should meet. She thought we were kindred souls, but actually the social event turned out to be a rather unfriendly encounter, because Dan at that point was very much embedded in a way of thinking that was associated with mainstream Cold War defense intellectuals. In fact, he was a brilliant rising star in that domain. And I was more or less, at least so far as Vietnam was concerned, very much opposed to the American role in Vietnam. So we didn't have a successful social meeting, but in retrospect, I learned a lot that later was exemplified in his what I might call post-transformational life, which started with the opposition to the Vietnam War and they culminated with the Pentagon Papers copying, because he, even in this sort of anti-peacenik, pro-government, pro-Cold War kind of posture, two qualities stood out that lasted throughout his life. One was the determination exhibited, particularly, I think, in his unusual enlistment in the U.S. Marines after graduating summa cum laude from Harvard as an undergraduate, which is very unusual for somebody with that kind of credential to do. And he combined that with a sense that authenticity, personal authenticity, is exhibited when you put your own life on the line and you show yourself and others that you're willing to take risks that would be involved in combat or in prison, a law extended prison term. These two qualities were exhibited in that period where he was later to be a RAND defense consultant, worked for McNamara, went to Vietnam with the counterinsurgency specialist Lansdale. And The other thing that struck me in retrospect again about our meeting there at Harvard was that had he not had this orientation that made him a credible participant at the highest levels of government, he never would have had access to the secret documents, either in the context of the Vietnam experience or later with respect to the nuclear war plans that he had worked on himself at the Pentagon.
I met Dan at a meeting of a friend's house that I was invited to dinner. This was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And we had a very pleasant dinner, had nothing to do with the Pentagon Papers. There was a young woman there who was of Indian descent, India. And after we walked out together and she said, let me show you something. And I said, sure. And she took me to her apartment and opened a closet door. And in the closet, there were stacks and stacks and stacks of Xerox papers. The Pentagon Papers were there. At that point, no one knew, or certainly I didn't know the meaning of all this until it was explained to me. But the question was, could I help in some way with the distribution of the Pentagon Papers? This was the 1960s, and war was on, and many of us, I had started an organization called Vietnam Summer to oppose the war, which is a national organizing strategy. And I look back on it, I didn't hesitate. I'm kind of a little bit jolted when I think, why didn't I think about it? But I certainly didn't hesitate to say, sure, let's do it. What can I do to help? And the question was, how do we distribute the papers? And what do we do about hiding Dan? So going to the second question first, I had a secretary at that time who was not very much involved in the anti-war movement, but a very, very nice woman. And I said, Nancy, we need your apartment. Could we have it for a bit of time? I can't explain to you what it's about, but it's just important. And so Nancy gave us the apartment. Dan moved into the apartment. He had, and someone else took charge of providing him with food and all he needed. The only thing I really remember that made me laugh was he wanted bars that you can put within a door so you could do pull-ups after that long time. That's a sidebar issue. So what happened then was a group of Harvard graduate students who worked with me, who I sort of recruited ad hoc, would help organize the distribution of this massive, massive amount of material. Dan's impulse was to drop it all at one time, get it out there. He worked so hard to get it and wanted to get it out. And I'd had some experience working in the Congress, both in the House and Senate. And I said, Dan, no, I've had some experience with the press. Let's do it piece by piece by piece. It's a huge amount of material. They'll never cover it all at once. If we do it piece by piece, we can probably keep this story running for 2 or 3 weeks. So he agreed to that. And what we then did was broke it up into chunks, not very academically or carefully because there wasn't any time. One of the graduate students would reach into the huge deposit of papers, scoop up a chunk of 6 inches thick, take it together, and then the question was how to get it to various newspapers. And there's a story in the Washington Post. There's a movie about this. Part of it. An example would be, excuse me. An example would be a reporter from one of the major newspapers, the Washington Post, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, or one other, Los Angeles Times, would be asked to go, in this instance, just sit and wait by the just wait by the ticket desk of a particular airline, and something will happen. And what would happen probably is a graduate student from Harvard working with me would move over and sit next to him and leave a box of papers, and that was it. And the chunk would be passed that way. Or another case, I remember in Cambridge, the reporter was at a motel or a hotel, and at a certain time, the graduate students would drop off a chunk of papers outside his door, and I would call him and I'd say, "Open your door," and he would find a box full of the Pentagon papers, huge amount. The Pentagon papers are very large, so we broke it up into all these pieces. And all the while, Dan was, as I said, hiding out in my secretary's apartment. So that's the story in a nutshell. There isn't a lot more to it, except that it worked for, I think we ran something like 18 weeks around the country, and each time the paper, like the Iowa, one of the papers in Iowa would publish it, and then the New York Times would pick it up, or the Washington Post would pick it up, and we kept the story alive that long. And Dan was hiding away in my secretary's apartment all this time. It was an intense period. It was the anti-war movement, and all of us were involved in the anti-war movement, and people were more than happy to volunteer. When I look back on it, it was obviously a dangerous moment. Dan used to tell me this. He liked to tell the story that he was in an apartment overlooking Harvard Square, and at that time, Harvard Square had a bank of 10 telephones in a row, payphones. You don't see those much anymore. Everyone's got cell phones. And what we would always use these cell phones in different parts of the Cambridge, Massachusetts area, or across the river, and moving from one cell phone to another. And he used to like to tease me about the fact he was looking out the window, and I was calling, I think, one of his relatives, I think in California, or someone. We were checking base, and I left whatever it was he wanted me to do. We set up. I don't recall the exact details, but he later told me that as soon as I walked away from this payphone in Harvard Square, police cars zoomed in on that area. They'd been tapping all those phones, obviously, and I wasn't aware of it because I was out of there by chance just before that all happened. So my role was minor in this respect, although it was really quite a strategic role, I suppose, because the graduate students did all this work, and Dan was, we were able to keep the story alive for something like 12 or 13 weeks by breaking it up in chunks, piece by piece. In brief, that's how I met Dan, and of course, got to know him very well. We became friends and saw each other thereafter on many occasions until this year and his passing.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but it's a pleasure to offer a few remarks about Dan Ellsberg. Others have surely spoken about Dan's moral and political courage, how central it was to his life, and what an inspiration it is to those of us who seek to build on his legacy. After all, no other former government official with Dan's access to power and privileged information has ever broken so radically with policies he once supported and taken such great personal risks to overturn them. Dan's transformation from war planner to peace activist is one of the most striking conversion stories in our history. But as Dan was quick to tell us, he was not acting alone. Too often, I think, we think of whistleblowers as isolated truth tellers and focus more on their actions and motives than on the important realities they bring to light or the larger historical context that inform their decision, including their relationship to collective movements for change. Dan would surely remind people that he acted as he did only because he was inspired by so many others: Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, Henry David Thoreau, and many others. One of his favorite quotations was from Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. Cast your whole vote, Thoreau said, not a piece of paper merely. He was inspired most of all, I think, by the thousands of young American draft resistors who went to prison in principled opposition to the Vietnam War, and especially Randy Keeler, who Dan heard speak at the War Resistors League Conference in August 1969. As many of you know, after hearing Randy speak about his willingness to go to prison, Dan went to the bathroom sobbing and asking himself what he might do to help end the war if he was willing to sacrifice his career and risk going to prison. As Dan often said, courage is contagious. I wish it were more contagious, but it is surely true that Dan more than paid back those who inspired him by inspiring many thousands of activists and whistleblowers over the decades. In fact, he supported and defended virtually every national security whistleblower that came after him, including Thomas Drake, Jesselyn Radack, Jeffrey Sterling, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, Julian Assange, and Reality Winner, just to name a few. And while I was heartened to see so much positive media attention paid to Dan in his final months, I couldn't help observing that many of the outlets that were lionizing Dan, including the New York Times, CNN, and the Washington Post, had rarely sought his opinion during his long life of activism that followed the release of the Pentagon Papers. And I know it pained Dan that he was often cast as the heroic, selfless, courageous whistleblower as a way to make invidious criticisms of the younger whistleblowers he supported. I took great pride that the University of Massachusetts awarded Dan an honorary doctorate this past January. It's appalling, however, that no other college or university ever did the same. In 2019, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where I teach history, acquired Dan's papers, a treasure trove of some 500 boxes of materials. The arrival of those papers inspired me to begin the biography of Dan, to teach a year-long seminar called Truth, Dissent, and the Life of Daniel Ellsberg, to host a 2-day international conference to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the Pentagon Papers release, and now something even more ambitious. We're trying to create at UMass a permanent Ellsberg Institute for Peace and Democracy. If you want to learn more about that or have ideas about how to make that happen, please do get in touch with me. I'd like to say a bit about Dan as a public educator and his extraordinary impact on my students. I wasn't honestly sure how the Ellsberg seminar would go. I mean, after all, most college students today come to my classes knowing little or nothing about Dan. But I do know this, even though the events of the 60s and 70s are distant history for them, they rightly sense that it was a time of hope and opportunity as well as turmoil and violence. And I think they flock to courses on the subject in part because they're looking for models of moral and political courage and hopefulness. And Dan certainly supplied that. I don't think I've ever had more engaged students. They were honestly thrilled by the opportunity to be the first people to explore his papers in our archives, and even more by the opportunity to be to talk with Dan via Zoom 4 or 5 times throughout the course, and in one class also with Patricia. It was for many of them, it's not an exaggeration to say, a life-changing experience that they are taking with them as they go off to the Peace Corps, to teaching, public service, and law school, and other things. I think the experience was made all the more relevant because it took place in 2020, 2021 at the height of the pandemic, with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, the big lie about the presidential election, the January 6th insurrection, and the second impeachment trial. Not exactly the same kinds of crises as the 60s and 70s, but certainly crises that really made the course all the more relevant and resonant. We also, in addition to looking at Dan's papers in the archives, we read his 2 extraordinary books, Secrets and the Doomsday Machine. Richard Falk has described those books as pedagogical memoirs, which I think is exactly right. Dan never wanted to talk exclusively about what he did, as is sometimes the case in conventional memoirs, but was much more interested in exploring the significance of historical events, why things changed, to what end, and why other things, often very bad things, persisted. What so impressed my students, about our Zoom conversations with Dan was not just how articulate and brilliant he was and remained at the age of 90, which was astonishing, but how he didn't give them canned answers. You could tell that he was still searching his mind for new ways of understanding, and he modeled for them not just moral and political courage, but a penetrating curiosity and openness to new ideas. You could almost see it in his expression as he was speaking. He was rethinking new evidence and told some of the students that he'd never heard the questions that they had asked and was delighted to take a crack at them. My students were hardly the only beneficiaries of Dan's generosity and teaching. I can't imagine anyone who has given more talks to college students, whether to crowds of hundreds or small seminars. He rarely said no to those invitations, and he often did it for free. He really was kind of an itinerant activist professor in some ways. And with the advent of Zoom in recent years, it seems like he did even more of these classroom appearances, spared as he was from the difficulty of travel. And with headphones, he could actually hear better in those settings. So a final thought. The word whistleblower might conjure up the image of a referee at a sporting event, calling out fouls in order to preserve the rules of the game. But Dan's whistleblowing had a far deeper intent and impact. He was really, in fact, a radical activist. For more than 50 years, he has been one of the most tireless and penetrating critics of US foreign policy and the ongoing presence of nuclear weapons. He was motivated not just to end the war in Vietnam, but to fundamentally change the basis of US foreign policy in an anti-imperial direction, to rein in the almost limitless power of the president to make war, to make foreign policy vastly more transparent and accountable to the public, and to challenge the long history and ongoing exercise of undemocratic, secret, and unaccountable global interventions, accompanied often by threats to use nuclear weapons. It might actually be more accurate to call Dan a mutineer than a whistleblower. The word mutiny is suggested by Ellsberg himself in a classic 1981 essay he wrote about anti-nuclear activism called Call to Mutiny. He concludes the essay by comparing the entire world to a cult that's been held hostage in a kind of suicide pact because of the ever-present threat of nuclear weapons. He compared the nuclear world to Jonestown in Guyana, where 900 Americans in the late 1970s were lured by a charismatic and dictatorial preacher named James Jones, who made his congregation rehearse mass suicide that was to be carried out if and when he believed the end times had arrived. The end time for Jonestown came in 1978 when Jones ordered the entire community, including many children and babies, to drink the cyanide-laced Kool-Aid. The ongoing presence of nuclear weapons, Ellsberg argued, put the entire world in a similar situation, like hostages living at the mercy of someone who, with a single order, could kill us all. Life in a nuclear world was like rehearsing for mass suicide. He ends the article with these provocative words: "We all live in Guyana now, and there is no place to run. It's time to say what the parents at Jonestown waited too long to say. No, not our children. This is craziness. We won't be a part of it. It is mutiny time in Jonestown, the revolt of the hostages." To the very end of his life, Dan was calling us to action, calling us to revolt. And I hope his example will make us all a bit more courageous. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Coleen Rowley, and I was extremely fortunate to not only become acquainted with Daniel Ellsberg, but to participate with him in various speaking panels, even to host him a couple of times for speaking events, to have long debates, mostly about his sadness about not having recognized earlier the problem of the Vietnam War and not having taken action even sooner than he did. And I always tried to reassure him that no human being in that kind of environment would have seen all of these facts any quicker than he did. But he did beat himself up a little bit, and he had some survivor's guilt. And perhaps that is the reason why, unlike other whistleblowers who sometimes stumble into truth telling and didn't realize the consequences and then never continue, especially if the wrongdoing continues, they don't continue their actions. But Daniel Ellsberg was very different. He continued to protest the wars and write books about the problem of nuclear weapons. I was arrested with him one time in Washington, D.C., and was in jail with Daniel Ellsberg because he continued to oppose these wars of aggression, and he tried in every way he could. I called him the Duracell bunny because he continued, again, for decades and decades, right up to the days before his death, which is very unusual and so remarkable. And in any case, I want to say that I really learned so much from Daniel Ellsberg about how to be a moral, decent person, to oppose organized murder, and to try to really, basically, he tried to save the world, because if we do go into nuclear holocaust, as he always feared, and he tried to point out in his writings in his book how easy that would be, even accidentally. We're lucky to be alive right now because there were accidents before this that, there was some forbearance. Otherwise, if people would have pressed the button when the protocol said they should, we wouldn't be around today. And so again, he was a great, remarkable example of trying to save the world from this terrible situation that we now find ourselves on the brink of, in even the worst terms. It's anyways, I want to give a tribute to this remarkable example of truth telling, and hope that, some of us, maybe in a combined way, we can try to pick up that torch and continue the efforts that he began at the end of the Vietnam War. Thank you so much.
One of the last interviews Dan gave was to the Sam Adams Associates for Integrity. We gave him our 21st award, even though he was godfather of all of us. Dan was not in such great shape that day, but he rose to the occasion at the end of his little talk, and he said, "Look, I want to quote him here. I've said to very many people, don't do what I did. Don't do what I did. Don't wait till the bombs are falling and thousands more have died. Blow the whistle, speak the truth now." Whoa. Now, I think that Dan might want me to do this, and so I'm going to do something a little bit unusual. I'm going to appeal to one person. Her name is Wendy Sherman. She has just stopped being Deputy Secretary of State, and she has nothing to lose by telling the truth. I looked a little bit into her background. She has a master's in social work. She was director of the Office of Child Protection in the state of Maryland. So she has a heart for what the Jewish people call the Anawim, the women, the widows, the refugees, the people ground under. So I can imagine, Wendy, how you felt working with Madeleine Albright when she thought that the perishing of 500,000 Iraqi children under the age of 5, quote, was worth it, End of quote. I can't imagine what it was like working for Victoria Nuland, because she clearly was calling the shots, not you, and not your nominal boss, Blinken. So Victoria Nuland, largely responsible for how many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian children this time? So let me just go back to your roots here. Your roots of a woman who cares about children, who cares about unnecessary warfare, and remind you that the president appointed you chief negotiator, not for the first time, the chief negotiator in Geneva to get Russians and US together to prevent a war. He promised 1 week before you got together with your Russian counterparts that he would not put offensive strike missiles in Ukraine. That was the 30th of December. He reneged on that promise, and no one knows that better than you, because you were forbidden to even discuss it. Now, here's my suggestion to you. Don't wait. Don't wait until the bombs start falling. Don't wait until the doomsday machine goes into full effect. Speak now. Tell the truth. Don't have a dialogue with your conscience. Just speak out from your inner being and tell American people what's really going on, in hopes that your whistleblowing, in the tradition of Dan Ellsberg, will prevent a god-awful war. That's my appeal to you. I hope that you'll listen to it. I hope that you'll get it and spare us what could be a catastrophe even worse than what we've seen heretofore. Thank you very much. Good luck, Wendy.
I'm Helen Caldecott. This is my tribute to my colleague, Dan Ellsberg. I'm a physician who has practiced for many years global preventive medicine, trying to save life on this beloved planet of ours. I often appeared with the beloved Dan as he talked about what nuclear war would mean. I read his last book, The Doomsday Machine. He left RAND, the corporation, where he was employed in the death industry. And let's be frank, almost the whole American economy is employed and devoted to the death and murder industry, which will destroy life on the planet. Dan was one of the few people who had absolute integrity, who worked within that industry and left it, releasing the Pentagon Papers. He was prepared to go to jail for the rest of his life. I am too. I mean, what's my life compared to this incredibly beautiful planet amongst 400 billion galaxies? Do we realize how precious it is? Dan did. And even to his dying day, Dan was still prepared and hoping that they would charge him and put him in jail again. How many people have that level of integrity and loyalty to life itself, and intelligence and brilliance and subtlety? Dan was a soft, loving man. He had a wonderful wife who supported him all the way, and gorgeous kids. He was so highly intelligent. And as he was dying, he was thrilled to bits because his doctor said he could take him off the salt-restricted diet so he could eat his bagels and lox and have hot chocolate. He was a man who lived a noble, noble life. We all should emulate him. Everyone in America who works for the death and murder industry, and that's the Pentagon and all their blasted corporations, should have the courage and integrity that Dan did. Now, if there is a heaven, Dan's up there. I don't believe in that. But if he is floating around, harping his harp with his wings flapping, Dan, we love you and we thank you. And please may you be a model for all the other millions of people who need to emulate you. Thank you, Dan.
Ode to a Whistleblower, written and read by Margaret Anna Alice. It starts as a whisper, a tickle in your throat, a glissando down your spine, a quiver in your stomach. The hairs on your arms rise up. A tremor pulses through your nervous system. Nausea washes over, engulfing you, until you can no longer contain it. What you've seen cannot be unseen. What you've heard cannot be unheard. What you've felt cannot be unfelt. What you know cannot be unknown. To speak that knowledge, to sing that secret, to roar that truth is to risk all: career, reputation, security, relationships, life. And yet to stifle it, to tamp it down, to suffocate it, is to sap your integrity, to stoke your guilt, to stab your soul. So you release it, let it fly, and it wings its way round the globe, waking, shaking, taking flight. You know your peace will be shattered. You know your days may be fewer. You know this could be your last song. But you belt it out anyway. You bellow it out because you whistle it to the stars, and the stars echo it back. You've rippled the ocean. You've whipped the wind. You've sparked the volcano. And even if the Goliaths target you, even if their thugs assault you, even if their scientists spike you, your truth will swell to a seismic wave, traveling upon the sea of the awakened, swallowing up our tyrannizers. We will trill your truth. We will warble your song. We will whistle your secret to the world until there are too many of us to silence.
They're on a shoestring, so if you could, any contributions to Whistleblowers, we appreciate it. Okay, and the last piece, Helen Caldecott. Dan is the father of whistleblowers. Helen Caldecott is the mother of nuclear whistleblowers. I'm here because of her. She changed my life. She revived Physicians for Social Responsibility. and we owe a lot to her. So I'm going to start with a little demonstration. And one of the things that Dan and I have a lifelong commitment to was the issue of the of preventing nuclear war and reversing the nuclear arms race. So this is something we did in the 1980s, right? Right, so the first sound that you're going to hear represents the total firepower of one Hiroshima bomb. Right, the next sound that you hear represents the total firepower in World War II. The next sound that you hear represents the total firepower on one Trident submarine. And the next sound you hear represents the total firepower that the world has developed at the peak of the nuclear arms race between the US and the USSR around 1986. He was a keynote at the International Psychohistorical Association in New York, and he talked about the targeting of civilians. And at the end of his riveting talk, I asked him, why you? 1,000 people knew what he knew. He said maybe 100 people had information that he had. Of all those people, what is it about you? Why were you the one that said anything? So he gave some philosophical answer. I said, no, like what about you? What about your life? So then he told a story about his life. So I'm going to just give 3 episodes. By the way, every whistleblower and each one of us is born into a historic moment in history and also into a personal, historical and personal forces that shape us. And tonight we're going to talk about Dan's evolution, personal evolution as a whistleblower, and we're all evolving. So the first story he told is that when he was 13, his family went on a trip to visit relatives in Denver, and his father fell asleep at the wheel. This is something that he speaks about often, and his mother and his sister were killed in the accident. So with the nuclear issue, he thought maybe he's wondering whether the government is falling asleep at the wheel, and also people often have a sense of, could you prevent the catastrophe that's very deep that motivates someone? The second story is, after that, Dan, in his ninth grade class, he had a teacher named Bradley Patterson. And don't ever underestimate, if you're a teacher, what you can say or do that can change the life of any of your students and change the world. So he described how, as a ninth grade social studies class in the fall of 1944, I was 13, boarding student on a full scholarship. So the teacher told them it was possible now to conceive of a bomb made of U-235, an isotope of uranium, which would have an explosive power 1,000 times greater than the largest bombs being used in the war that was then going on. German scientists in late 1938 had discovered that uranium could be split by nuclear fission in a way that would release immense amounts of energy. Suppose then that one nation or several chose to explore the possibility of making this into a bomb and succeeded. What would be the probable implications of this for humanity? This is an assignment given by a teacher to a group of 13-year-olds. How would it be used by humans and states as they were today? Would it be on balance bad or good for the world? Would it be a force for peace, for example, or for destruction? We were to write a short essay on this within a week. So everyone, concluded that it would be bad for, they all agreed that it would be bad for humanity. And then 9 months later, he saw a newspaper that a city was destroyed in Japan, and he knew, he understood what was going on, and he saw the whole world rejoicing. So another feature of Whistleblowers is kind of you see a deeper level of reality, and then a discrepancy between two reality, maybe the way the world sees something and what you know to be true underneath. So this shaped his life. And then just a third example I'll give is that Dan's father quit his job at Hanford at a plant, and he was a structural engineer for a big plant in Hanford. So years later, when Dan's father was 89, he asked him, "Why did you quit the job? Why did you quit your job?" He never had asked him that before. And he said he quit it because they were going to ask him to develop the H-bomb, and that it was 1,000 times more powerful than the A-bomb, and he couldn't do it. And then he asked his father, "Did anyone else quit?" No, he was the only one who quit. And he said, why did you quit? And he said, "Because of you." And Dan said, "What?" He said, "Why? Because of me." So he said, when you were, I guess it was when you were around 15, he said you came home and you read a book and you were crying. So the book was Hiroshima by John Hershey. So then Dan's father read the book. So because of that, Dan's father quit. And then, so anyway, you never know what's going to impact you. So with that, I will pass it to John. I'll have people introduce themselves. We're going to speak up, we may flow back and forth.
I guess we're going to go chronologically.
Yeah.
So I met Dan when I was an undergraduate at Harvard, and I had a seminar salon at the Kennedy Institute. And Dan, my name is John Henry, and I'm a businessman, but I'm also one of the founders of the Committee for the Republic, which we'll talk about. So I met Dan, and he came and spoke, and then the second time I met him was Frankie Fitzgerald I was working on her book, Fire in the Lake, and I think she got a major award for that, and I'd written my thesis on the Vietnam War, and she wanted to interview me, so I went over to Cambridge to her house, and she said, "Would you like to stay for dinner?" And I said, "Sure." And Dan Ellsberg shows up for dinner, so it was Frankie Fitzgerald's boyfriend and myself and Dan. And so I'm 75 now, Dan was 92, so he was 17 years older than me. He was, and everyone, the other three were all in the same age. So Dan was too young to be my father, but old enough to be an older brother. And they got in he got in an argument with this other guy who was living with, and he blurted out, "Next week," this is my recollection, and I'll tell you why, it may not be correct. He blurted out that Pentagon Papers are coming out next week, and Henry Smith and Neil Sheehan are holed up in this hotel in New York, and they're not even in the main offices because they don't. And we didn't know what the Pentagon Papers were. Something like that, but nothing, no idea. And so it turns out Henry Smith corrected me that he said, "There's no way." This was the New York Times went to publication on the 13th of June, and my birthday was on the 15th, as I remember, and then the Post went on the 18th. So Dan took has enormous courage, and so we gave Dan the Committee for Republic the Defender of Liberty Award on June 30th, 2021, 2 years ago, on the 50th anniversary, not of the Times publication of the Post or any of the other publications, but on the Supreme Court decision. And so it was really just amazing how much courage it took, because it's hard to convey this, because every hour that went by and every day that went by, he was more and more at risk. They were all these FBI guys, searching for him. And he would call up Sheehan, and Sheehan would have to go out of the hotel and into a telephone booth because they didn't want to be. And Dan was an obsessive personality. Everyone knows that. An obsessive personality. And obsessive personalities are often effective. And he wouldn't have been as effective as he was, but he was all over Sheehan. And so the lawyers inside, Dan didn't know this at the time, but the Legislative Council did not want to publish this. They said, we'll all go to jail. Sheehan was as obsessive as Dan. The public had a right to know. And Heather was a younger guy. And they were shocked when they were doing this, because they knew that the government lied, but they didn't realize the depth of mendacity all the way through. So governments lie, well, empires lie, republics don't. There's accountability, but empires do. So they were radicalized, and Abe Fortas was a hawk. But in the end, he went with Sheehan, and they took Schulzberger out to, they went against the orders. They were published on the 13th, and they took Schulzberger out to play golf so he couldn't change his mind. And so Dan was taking this enormous risk day by day, and he didn't know. That's why it couldn't have been accurate that he said that. I may have put it because it happened next week, right? But it went down to the wire, and it could have gone the other way. And so when I got out of college, the only job I wanted in the world was to work for Senator Fulbright, because he had the hearings on the Vietnam War. And that's what they try to do, is get Congress to do its job. And so the problem is that the reason why we have, the big point here is that the only reason that we're here tonight and celebrating whistleblowers is because it's very simple, because Congress is not doing its job. The Constitution is a 17 enumerated powers of government, 5 these people are actors. You do not, you can win an election in the Senate or the House or the President or Vice President. You cannot take office unless you put your hand on the Bible and swear to uphold the Constitution. And they're not doing it. So they're violating their oath of office. And so we have a bunch of actors here in Washington. Forget Hollywood, we've got the biggest actors in the world here. And they have real money. We've got 25% of the GDP. So anyway, Dan is the outward invisible sign, if you will, of this inward weakness. That we have the breakdown of the greatest idea in human history, separation of powers, and we have, Ellsberg jumps into the breach, becomes the father of the whistleblowers, and creates the opportunity for us to give John Kiriakou the award for standing up on bullshit. I'll come back.
Okay, thank you. Michael, 15 minutes for the rest of the panel.
We can talk fast, come on.
All right, okay.
Speed it up, speed it up.
That's a challenge. I'm Peter Kuznick. I teach history at American University and I direct the Nuclear Studies Institute. I'm going to talk not about Dan, not as a historian, but as my closest personal friend in many ways. We've all been talking about the Oppenheimer movie. Christopher Nolan said that Oppenheimer was the most important man who ever lived because he oversaw the creation of the bomb, desperately tried to control it afterwards. Dan's life takes a very, very different trajectory. Oppenheimer starts off in his 30s as a man on the left, and then he effectively becomes a man of the establishment, and really sacrifices so many of his earlier values. Dan was the opposite. Dan starts off as a Christian Scientist and Cold Warrior, and then moves steadily to the left. And then he gives up all the perks. He could have been part of the establishment like Oppenheimer was, but he rejected that. Not only rejected, he faced 115 years in prison. There is nobody I ever knew who loved life more than Dan Ellsberg. Those of you who knew him intimately, like some of us did, know that this is a man who loved every aspect of life. And when I first met Dan decades ago, he was giving a talk at the American University Law School about nuclear issues. We got together afterwards. We talked about our mutual concerns about threat of nuclear war and nuclear winter. But what really bonded us was when Dan asked what else I teach, and I said I teach the history of American sexuality. Now then he really lit up. And that's what really cemented our friendship over the next several decades. Because Dan was complicated, involved, engaged, loving, warm, but loved life completely and was willing to sacrifice that to end the war in Vietnam. There's so many stories that I can tell, but let me just tell you a few. One is, in 2006, I took students for my first trip to Vietnam. It was part of an honors class, and so I decided to bring Dan Ellsberg with us, and Barbara came with us, and some of my other close friends. This was mostly a student trip, and it was Dan's first time back to Vietnam since the 1960s. And they rolled out the red carpet for us. The Vietnamese were so thrilled. The media was all around us. Madame Binh, the great negotiator in Paris, gave Dan an award. And then Dan and I had a private meeting with General Giap, who was 95 years old at the time, and had defeated the French and defeated the Americans, was Vietnam's hero, and to him, Dan was one of his heroes. So he went to his home with his wife and his children and his grandchildren and his great-grandchildren. But to see the respect that Giap had for Dan was truly heart-stopping. But it was not just that. Dan also performed his magic tricks for the children of Vietnam. He took out his handkerchiefs and he had them mesmerized. And we took the students to the Coochie tunnels. Anybody's been there, I wouldn't dare go down in those tunnels, but there was Dan who was already well into his 70s going down into these tunnels that were just, hard to imagine somebody at that age or any age having the courage to go into. Another Dan story, we did lots of events together. We did whistleblower events at American University that we organized with Ray McGovern and others, and we'd always coordinate with one of my evening classes. I taught a very big class and still do, called Oliver Stone's America. And so Dan would often come in. And I remember one time I had introduced him, and well, I won't get into that story, but Dan was always there and always coming to every event. When he lived in Washington, he would come into class twice a semester to talk to my students, and my students loved him. Dan, let me just tell you about Vietnam. One of my students just wrote this to me recently. He wrote, and this is not a 20-year-old, this was the head of the cryptological program at the National Security Agency. He was a graduate student, and he wrote, Dr. Kuznick, I owe you a great debt for so many things. However, your invitation to join you and Dan Ellsberg on the trip to Vietnam was one of the greatest moments of my life. No lie. I learned so much during the trip. I didn't want it to end. He was a great man. I don't believe in a hereafter. And as H.L. Mencken once noted, there's always a chance I could be wrong. If that is the case, I hope to speak to Dan again somewhere in the great beyond. Hope you are safe and well. Pat Whedon. He would, my students would write back to me and tell me about the time that Dan would talk to my nuclear culture class and talk about the bomb being dropped. Robert Server calculated it took 43 seconds for the bomb to fall the 6 miles to the earth before it detonated. And Dan would tell them, well, imagine what people were doing during those 43 seconds. They were eating breakfast. They were going to work. They were getting ready for school. They were making love. It would go on and on for 43 seconds, and the students, again, were totally captivated and mesmerized. I invited Dan. I organized the first Iraq War teach-in in 2003. We didn't know it was going to be the first Iraq War teach-in, and Dan was flying in to join us as the keynoter. And Dan calls from the airport and said, "Peter, they just started dropping the bombs. Let's go to the Pentagon and get arrested." I said, "Dan, we can't. We've got this big teach-in tomorrow. C-SPAN is covering the whole thing live. It's the first national teach-in." Dan went down and got arrested without me. Then I sent my lawyer to go bail him out at midnight that night. And he woke, he didn't sleep that night, but he came in and of course was brilliant the next morning at the teach-in. So many Dan Ellsberg stories. I remember going, when I was much younger, to the 70th birthday party that Cy Hirsch threw for Dan. And I said, wow, 70 seems so old. It doesn't seem so old anymore. But my wife and I gave an 88th birthday party for Dan just a few years ago. And it was also an 80th birthday party for Barbara Capel, our close friend. And Dan read a poem there that if I had more time, I would read to you.
You don't be on the website. We'll put it on the website.
We'll put it on the website. Okay. Thank you for listening.
My name's Ann Wright. I'm a retired Army colonel. I used to be a diplomat. I resigned in 2003 in opposition to the war in Iraq. And that's what threw me into the likes of all of you all. And it was in 2004, and the reason I'm wearing this lovely Veterans for Peace t-shirt, my very best one, is because it was at a Veterans for Peace convention that I first met Dan Ellsberg. You know, I've been in the government for 30 years. I knew dissidents all over the world, but I didn't know dissidents in the United States. I, of course, had heard of Daniel Ellsberg. I'd heard of, all these people, but they were at this Veterans for Peace conference, and somebody came over and said, "You got to meet Daniel Ellsberg." Okay, well, I will. And Dan said, "Well, it's good that you left the government, you resigned. What papers did you bring out?" Jesus, what papers? My last assignment was Mongolia, and I'll tell you, the U.S. government won't tell me this jack shit about anything in Mongolia. So it was like, "What do you mean?" Well, everybody brings out papers. You got to have papers. You got to have this. And it was like, ooh, man, this guy, ooh. Well, over time, I got to know Dan Ellsberg a little bit better, and all of you all, and I appreciate so much what all the real whistleblowers did. I just resigned. I got out of there, that was it. But over the years, between Coleen Women for Peace, Veterans for Peace, and Daniel Ellsberg being at various events, and I'll just kind of end with one little story about going down to Guantanamo when Bradley Manning, Chelsea Manning, was incarcerated in Guantanamo, and we got a whole bunch of people to go down there. Many of you all in the audience, raise your hand if you were down in Guantanamo, or not Guantanamo, but it could have been, what was it? Quantico. Quantico, thanks. It was Guantanamo North. Anyway, yeah, there you go. So we were there, and Dan and I had been designated to take flowers, stupid-ass flowers, over to this monument at the headquarters, or the gate. You know, it's like, why are we taking flowers? I don't know, but let's just go. And we put the flowers down, and there were people that were speaking, and halfway back across the road, it was like, well, let's just sit down in the middle of the road. And Dan at that point was hard of hearing, and it was like, what'd you say? I said, sit down in the road. Okay, fine. And we just sat down, and then everybody jumped the fences, and everybody came out, and we all got arrested right there in Guantanamo, North. And then I wrote a little book, co-authored a book called Dissent, Voices of Conscience. And the publisher, you know, small little publisher, because your big publishers don't go for this sort of stuff. So the publisher said, if we want anybody to read this, we need to get somebody of note. And I said, well, Dan and I got arrested one time together. I said, well, will you email Dan and see if he'll provide a little tiny introduction? So I emailed him, and he went, yeah, I'll be glad to do that. And here it was the night before everything was to go to the publisher, and Dan hadn't sent anybody. Send in anything. So the publisher said, I know somebody who lives over in Berkeley, I'll go to the door, knock on the door and say, could you please just, write one paragraph? We only want one paragraph in this book. The next morning, there was a chapter. And Mary, I'm sure, would know this, that her dad would stay up all night to do whatever it was for any of the people that were trying to say no to our government, no to war, no to all of this crap that they're giving to us. So, long live Dan Ellsberg!
I'm with the Peace Group Code Pink, and I was enamored with Dan from the time I was a teenager because I became active around the Vietnam War and realized that this guy was a hero. And little did I know that in my lifetime I would get a chance to actually get arrested with him many times. He even opened up his home when I ran for senator against Dianne Feinstein in 2000, and he was a man so ahead of his time, he thought Dianne Feinstein should resign 23 years ago. We did so many amazing things together that we went on speaking tour about Iraq and against George Bush. We got arrested together around torture, Guantanamo, supporting the Iran nuclear deal, supporting the whistleblowers, and to bring it up to date, when I was writing a book recently about the war in Ukraine, I thought I better call Dan and see what his take on this, because I couldn't believe so many people, as we were just talking about, John, whose heads had been turned around by this war in Ukraine. And so I thought, let me see what Dan thinks. And I just want to read you a couple of things that he said. He said, he roundly condemned Russia, said it was an enormous mistake and he had no doubt they were committing war crimes, but he was so angry at U.S. policy. He said a lot of Americans wanted this war and they got just what they wanted. In fact, it's playing out even better than they could have imagined, with huge arms sales to our allies and the U.S. once again at the helm of European policy. He said he was worried that the war over control of Donbass and Crimea would lead to a nuclear confrontation, and he called the conflict with Russia, and he added in with China, a form of insanity on the par of QAnon. He said, U.S. policy of sabotaging peace talks in order to weaken Russia is not only wicked, but a crime against humanity. So I was looking through my pictures with Dan and all the wonderful times he had come to Code Pink events, and I found my favorite one, which was when Dan agreed to be at the head of the San Francisco Gay Pride Parade contingent for what was then Bradley Manning. It is now Chelsea Manning. And he had this big sign that said, when they came for Bradley Manning, I spoke out. And he was wearing a wonderful pink boa. So in honor of Dan, I have a pink boa on, and let's say together, Dan Ellsberg presente. Dan Ellsberg presente. Thank you.
I'll keep it very quick. My name is John Kiriakou, former CIA officer in the Whistleblowers. I owe so much to Dan Ellsberg, I don't even know where to begin. It would take an hour to just give an overview of it. But I first became aware of Dan Ellsberg when I was 6 years old, because my parents always talked about current events at the dining room table, and they made it clear from the release of the Pentagon Papers, Dan Ellsberg was a hero in our house. In 1972, when I was in second grade, Mrs. Levine, my teacher, had a little straw poll in advance of the election. Who did you want, Nixon or McGovern? She said. And one of the kids said, it's McGovern, Mrs. Levine. It doesn't matter, she said. So Nixon got like 28 votes. McGovern got like 2. and I voted for Dan Ellsberg. I'm not often starstruck, I really am not, but I was starstruck when I finally got to meet Dan and to speak to him for the very first time. It was immediately after my arrest on multiple espionage charges in 2012, all of which were dropped, by the way. I felt an immediate bond with this great man, and not just because of what he did with the Pentagon Papers, or with nuclear weapons, or with a lifetime of protest. It was because of his humanity. And this is the thing that always came through in every communication that we had. I went to prison for 2 years, and Dan wrote to me regularly, and he would send me books, and he would sign every one of his letters, "Love, Dan." And I knew that he meant it. He meant "Love, Dan." And I would talk to my wife on the phone from prison and say, "Oh, I got the most beautiful letter from Dan today," and I would tell her about it. Well, I wasn't thinking at the time that the prison guards were reading all of my incoming mail. I knew that they were, but I didn't give it much thought. And they were listening to my phone calls. And then sure enough, in the town where I was incarcerated, it was called Loretto, Pennsylvania. The only thing in the town is the prison and a little teeny tiny Catholic university. Saint somebody or something, I don't really even remember what it is. And Dan came to speak. And wouldn't you know that the prison guards went to listen to him because of all the letters that they had read that he was sending. The Greeks have a word, it's axios. It means he is worthy. And that's the only thing that I can think of is axios. We were blessed to know this man. The last time I talked to Dan, and it was so touching, I'll remember it for the rest of my life. What Dan wanted to talk about was how my children were doing. He asked me 3 times. Coming back to it, well, how are your children doing? Are they doing okay? Where's your son going to college? He wanted to know all the details. And then I said to him, Dan, I have to tell you, knowing that this was the last time I was going to speak to him, I said, Dan, as difficult as this has been for you, the example of dignity that you have set for the rest of us is something that is incalculable. You won't even know the lives that you've touched. And he said, you know, the only good thing about dying is I can eat anything I want. And when I finish talking to you, he said, I'm going to tell my wife that I love her, and I'm going to eat the second half of the greasiest, saltiest chicken stir-fried rice that you've ever had. And that was the last thing he said to me. I'm going to miss him very much. Great friend.
Dan Ellsberg left me a voicemail a couple weeks before he.
Thank you.
Yeah, I want to play this one thing from Dan Ellsberg voicemail.
I got something.
Take 30 seconds.
I got 40 minutes to Dan Ellsberg. I got 40 minutes to Dan Ellsberg. Let's go ahead.
Okay.
I thought we had
All right.
7:30.
All right. Thank you all. Anyway, Dan tried to make it safe for us, so let's all find our own inner courage, find each other, connect with each other, and build our tribe. There's 16 members.